Hello viewers, I'm SB and welcome back to Pyre, about which it turns out I have a few thoughts. So the first thing I want to talk about is narrative and the ability to lose, but before I get into that, so I guess it turns out not to be the first thing, I just want to say thanks to Oniawar for suggesting early on in the series that I turn the difficulty up to heightened, because I think the experience was dramatically improved by the fact that losing was a serious possibility in most rights. You all saw how it went. I think the game would have been much less affecting if we had never lost. Okay, so to get into it here, you're probably noticing this is coming quite a bit after the last episode of the series. And that's because I had to take a couple of runs at this. When I first attempted to record this, I started by saying that I really appreciate that Pyre allows you to fail at things and suffer consequences, but that doesn't stop the game, which is a thing that other games don't do, really. But partway through making that argument, I realized that I didn't actually agree with it. See, I was experiencing all throughout Pyre a sense of familiarity, a vague feeling that this game reminded me of something. And it wasn't until I was recording the initial version of this that it finally just snapped into focus. Pyre is actually something I've been loudly and repeatedly telling people I've wanted for over a decade. A spiritual successor to NHL Hitz 2003 for the PlayStation 2. Hear me out on this. NHL Hitz was the hockey adaptation of the principles of the much more popular and well-known NFL Blitz series, both of which are great, by the way. Hitz 2003, which was the second and I think final game in the series, had a franchise mode in it that, much to my delight, turned out to basically be a crazy hockey RPG. You went from place to place, playing hockey, or whatever it is that you call the hockey-adjacent thing that Hitz is, accumulating XP, getting gear that could be equipped on your players to improve their stats, accomplishing randomized optional challenges in each game to get additional stuff. I mean, this sounds familiar, right? So this got me thinking. You could lose a game in Hitz, and it wasn't the end of the world. You'd be bummed out, you wouldn't get your, magic glove that gives your goalie +4 puck stopping or whatever it was. But you could just you would keep going, and that would just be part of your team's story. In fact, all sports games, really, in season or franchise modes, let you fail and absorb the consequences and continue on. And then I started thinking, well, it's not that different to lose a battle in Total War, right? And of course, you can lose a mission in XCOM without it ending your game immediately. You just absorb the consequences, and they're meaningful, and then you move on in that new context. So, why is it that Pyre felt so novel to me? Is it just that I was wrong, that I felt like it was novel, but it actually wasn't, that I do not, in fact, know what I'm talking about, that I'm basically just a big idiot? Well, hold on. Let me hastily offer a complicated explanation that somehow makes none of this about my own failings. So, I think most games fall into one of two broad narrative styles. First, there are games with what I'll call a hands-on narrative, by which I mean games that are out to tell you a story. They usually have a linear narrative or a simple, tree-structured narrative, and it gets fed to you in text or voiceover or cinematics. And because they're trying to take you from point A to point B in a story that's already been written, there's not a lot of room for variance. You have to succeed or the story doesn't work. So when you fail, they just rewind and have you try again. A lot of styles of games fall into this category. I'm thinking things like basically every JRPG to shooters like Wolfenstein or Half-Life or the Call of Duty campaigns, third-person brawlers like the Arkham games or Devil May Cry, puzzle games like Portal, platformers. It's a very common way of constructing and presenting a story in a game, right? And you sort of play the bits between the plot points. The other narrative style, which I'll refer to as hands-off narrative by contrast, is much less about telling you a story and more about handing you a series of systems and letting you create your own story through play, through your interaction with those systems. Sports games are a great example of this. We would not generally think of a sports game as having a story, but after you've played through a season, you have the story of your team and what happened to them in that season, and that might be meaningful to you. That might be something you tell people, right? The kinds of strategy games I play a lot of here on the channel have a similar approach to narrative, a lot of them, as does pretty much anything that's described as a sandbox. Dwarf Fortress, Oxygen Not Included, that kind of stuff. And of course, it's not quite as simple as everything being totally in one box or the other. You have genres like CRPGs that are often sort of the one thing tucked inside of the other thing. But as a course tool for understanding how game narratives are developed and presented, I think this is useful for understanding what's cool about Pyre. Because I think where Pyre really succeeds is that it blends the best parts of the two styles. You get the strong characterization, the emotional resonance stuff that hands-on narratives are good at, while also getting the sense of the weight of your actions and choices and the real potential of meaningful failure that you get from hands-off narrative. In reality, the structure of Pyre's narrative probably isn't much more than the tree style with just sort of like an unusual number of kind of like floating branches. But it manages to put a weight behind your decisions that makes your choices in the liberation rites and the matches between feel much more significant and makes losses at key moments feel really heartbreaking, which I experienced firsthand a couple of times there. And they would probably just be meaningless at best and annoying at worst if failure simply meant retrying, right? And of course, as those who've been around here for a while know, I'm always very much in favor of non-catastrophic representations of failure, which is something I could talk about for a very long time, but it's maybe beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So the narrative design is definitely the thing that struck me the most. But I also really enjoyed the actual content and themes of the narrative, the meaning of conviction and justice and worthiness, and the way that the identity of those concepts sort of shifts as we require it to, or as we want it to as a society. The way that justice systems are necessarily built on and driven by political concerns, society's treatment of convicts and outcasts. These are themes that have always been important sort of to the project of society, but maybe are especially important right now, especially right here in America. And also, by that same token, deserving of far more consideration than I'm capable of giving them here while talking about how much I liked the fantasy basketball video game. So I won't dig too deep into that, but suffice it to say that I think this was not just a great story, but a great story to tell in this time and place. Now, I always say that these are not reviews, because who could possibly need a review at the end of a long Let's Play series, but I do want to mention before wrapping up here that I thought the art and the music were both fantastic. Every presentational element of this game was just spectacular. The actual gameplay of the rites was really fluid and fun. I was concerned that it might end up feeling too slow and simple when it turned out that the characters that you aren't actively controlling just stand there and wait the whole game, but as you all saw, it did not turn out to be too simple and slow for me at all. In fact, quite the opposite on a number of occasions. So, I guess we're headed toward the end here. You know, I almost didn't play this on the channel, and honestly, if I hadn't been interested in doing it for the channel, I might not have played it at all. Like, I definitely still would have bought it, but I own both Bastion and Transistor, and I have for a long time, like probably most of you in the audience do as well. And between the two of them, I've played maybe like a total of an hour, despite the fact that I think they both seem very cool. It's just, you know how things are, especially now, in this period where it seems like great, incredible video games are coming out every single week. So, in a sense, you all are responsible for me getting into this game the way I did, so thanks. I had a great time doing silly voice acting and playing Fantasy 3-on-3 Magic Ball, and I hope you all enjoyed me stretching my legs a little bit and trying out some different stuff. Strategy will probably always be my favorite genre, and there's always going to be strategy games here, but I play a lot of different stuff, and I'm looking forward to continuing to bring you all the weird mix of whatever that I love. So, thank you all for watching. Please feel free to talk about the game and your feelings on it, or just argue with me, if that's what you want to do, in the comments below, and we'll see you next time. Actually, before we get out of here, there's one more thing I want to talk about. This is pretty weird. I'd love to know what you guys think of this. So, while I was thinking about NHL hits 2003, I remembered that my franchise mode teams always had the same team captain. Hits lets you, use a variety of like wacky player heads. And my team captain was always a dude of the maximum available size who was an anthropomorphic shark. He had a big shark head. And I named him after the greatest athlete that young SB had ever seen on American Gladiators, because that's where young SB saw athletes. It will probably surprise very few of you that I have never really been into sports that much. So I decided to look this guy up. I was like, hey, man, I haven't thought about that guy in forever. So I looked him up, and just curious, if he ever went on to be like a professional athlete of any kind or anything, because dude crushed on that ridiculous game show. I don't even know what you would call American Gladiators. It's a game show, right? Anyway, so I was like, I wonder if this guy ever became a professional athlete. I looked him up, and he did. He became a professional fighter. Actually, he was in one of the earlier UFCs, and he got some MMA titles like back before they were really calling it MMA. And he was on the U.S. World Wrestling team as a Greco-Roman wrestler. And it's all very impressive, physical athletic stuff. But I also found, the first link I found about him was a story about his life that included the fact that he successfully tried out, I don't know, do you audition? I don't know what the right term is for this. But he got a screenwriting fellowship from the Walt Disney Corporation, and that he was recognized by the National Poets Society as one of the top 500 living poets and invited to speak at their national convention in Washington, D.C. And I was like, that's awesome. What a cool story. And I was like, I thought, okay, I'll tell that in the video, right? But then I thought, well, hold on. This is just some unsourced garbage on a webpage. I don't know if you know this. Anybody can make those. So I decided to look for a little verification before coming to you guys and representing it as the facts. And I can't find anything that suggests that this dude ever wrote anything in his entire life. In fact, I did not realize there is not a National Poets Society in the United States. We have societies for poetry, but none of them are called that. And as far as I could find, none of them have a yearly convention in Washington, D.C. So I started looking for more references on this, and that story about him being a nationally recognized poet and him being a screenwriter and him helping to make this movie exists in several places, but it all seems to be quoted. I don't know what the original source was, but it's the same wording everywhere. And so, like, I don't know what's weirder. If this guy actually is some kind of, like, warrior poet, but there's no evidence, or if it's the case that somebody, potentially this dude himself, but maybe not, right? Maybe just a fan, somebody who was really blown away by him on American Gladiators, decided that this should be his legacy, regardless of what the truth is, and then it kind of seems to have stuck. I don't know which one of those is the cooler, weirder story. Anyway, that's actually it. Now I'm out of stuff to talk about. I just thought that was weird. I'd love to hear which one of those you think is the weirder story down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching and for sticking around and listening to that weird rambling. Come back next time. I don't even know what's coming up in the near future, but we'll see you then.